Shalom, shalom. This is Rav Johnny. I hope you're well. I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person. Nevertheless, I hope this video works and this provides us with an opportunity to continue our learning of the Rambam's Hilchot, Yesodei, HaTorah. So last week we really got off to a great start. We introduced the Rambam and we understood why he's writing this book, which is to teach us about the fundamentals. In fact, more than that, we learned from HaPerush, we learned from the commentary, we learn also from other more modern thinkers that absent of an understanding of machshava, it's likely to be that our shmirat mitzvot will be compromised, which is why our learning is so essentially important. Today, what we're going to do is continue our study of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. Hopefully cover Perek Aleph Halachot Bet to Dalet, chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. And hopefully, please God, you'll have this handout, and through our study together, I very much intend that you'll be able to appreciate these halachot and learn them, and we'll gain a deeper insight as to what the Rambam is discussing. So I want to share my screen here of halachot bet to dalet, and though I'm not with you in person, what we would be doing anyway is I would now take a pause, and I'd say, either on your own or in a chavrota, I want you to learn halachot bet to dalet. I want you to read the words in Hebrew, or if you prefer in English, just consider what they mean. Meditate what you believe the Rambam is saying, because unless you have an ownership of this text, then certainly you may well just hear the commentaries that we're reading, but not necessarily see how they're getting what they say. And if perhaps you have an alternative understanding, not necessarily have crystallized what that understanding may well be. So I want you to take a few minutes now, and we'll pause the video, and I'd like you to study halachot bet, gimel, and dalet as you see here on the screen, and perhaps in your notebook, jot down some questions you may have on these halachot, insights you may have. And once you pause this video and you do that for a few minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I'd like the video to be resumed. We can continue in our conversation. Having had that pause, I hope that you've had an opportunity to explore and consider these three halachot. I'd like to go through them one by one, just in terms of meaning, and then we'll try and look at some of the commentaries found on this daf mekorot. So let's look at halacha bet. Ve'im ya'aleh al hadat shehu eno matzui, en davar acher yachol limatzah. What is the Rambam saying? We translate it here as, if one would imagine that God does not exist, he does not exist, no other being could possibly exist. Simply put, if God doesn't exist, we couldn't exist. This is a klal in terms of our belief in God. If God doesn't exist, we can't exist. Our entire world is predicated on God's will and God's existence. That is halacha bet. What do we learn from halacha gimel? ואם יעלה על הדעת שאין כל הנמצאים מלבדו מצויים, הוא לבדו יהיה מצוי, ולא יבטל הוא לביטולם. שכל הנמצאים צריכים לו, והוא ברוך הוא אינו צריך להם, לא לאחד מהם. לפיכך אין אמיתתו כאמיתת אחד מהם. From this halacha, which is translated as, if one would imagine that none of the entities aside from him exist, he alone would continue to exist, and the nullification of their existence would not nullify his existence, because all the other entities require him, and he, blessed he, does not require them, nor any one of them. Therefore, the truth of his being does not resemble the truth of any of their beings. I think there are three main points being said here. Point number one, if only God exists and we wouldn't, our lack of existence wouldn't negate God's existence. Point number two, we need God, but in so many ways, God doesn't need us. And point number three, which perhaps is harder to understand in this series, is God's truth is different to ours. Let's move on to halacha daled, because we're now going to focus more on this notion of truth. Hu shanavi omer, and this is quoting a pasuk for Yirmiyahu, Hashem Elokechem emet, which of course is what we say at the end of the third paragraph of the Shema. Hu levado ha'emet ve'en lacher emet kamitato. Hu HaTorah omeret en od milvado. Klomar en sham matzui emet milvado kamot. Meaning this is implied by the prophet's statement, specifically the final point that he makes, in the end of Halacha Gimel. Now in Halacha Dalet, the Rambam is saying this is implied by the prophet's statement, and God, your Lord, is true, i.e., He alone is true, and no other entity possesses truth that compares to His truth. This is what is meant by the Torah statement. There is nothing else aside Him, en od milvado, i.e., aside from Him, there is no true existence like God's. So we have a number of very interesting statements here being presented by the Rambam. And these are statements and teachings which he believes are essential for us to know. We're now going to begin the journey of trying to make sense of them. Now, like I said last time, I'm not able to look through these halachot comprehensively. There are many, many, many different commentaries, and I encourage every one of you to take the opportunity to look through those commentaries and see what may well speak to you. What I have done is compile some commentaries which I hope to be resonant to you. So let's look at source number one, which comes from Torat Menachem. As mentioned, let's now look at the Torat Menachem. And this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where in this instance, so let's look at the Torat Menachem. Let's look at the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where he gives some insights on this halacha. He says as follows, and I'm going to be offering some other translations for those who wish. He begins by quoting a pasuk from Tehillim, Kuf Yud Tet Samach, Pei Tet, chapter 119, pasuk 89. K'tiv le'olam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shem. What does this mean? Forever, God, your word stands in heaven. The Parish of Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov says on this, Ki devarcha she'amarta yehi rakia b'toch hamayim. This refers to the words, when it says, Le'olam yehi dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim, that your word should stand in heaven, means the words you said about creation, those tevot ve'otiyot, Elohem nitzavot ve'omdot le'olam, b'toch rakia hashamayim. Those words, those letters, perpetually stand forever as part of heaven. Why? Lachayot, to give us life. Ki'ilu hayu ha'otiyot mistalkot karega. Because even if those words were to disappear, even momentarily, v'chas v'shalom chozot l'mkoram, and go back to their origin, hayu kol hashmayim ayin ve'efes, then the whole heaven would turn to nothingness. It would turn to as if you've done rewind on the 6 days of creation. Well, and now he quotes from the Balatanya, et kulam, that God, we generally say that you, God, gives us life. Don't say give life, but instead, God, you continually bring things to life. What the Rebbe is teaching, quoting the pasuk from Tehillim, as explained by Baal Shem Tov, making reference to the Balatanya, is that God is perpetually maintaining the world. The creation was an event, but it continues to occur in every moment. And that absent of God's will for the world, there wouldn't be a world. Absent of God's will for us, we would not exist. Ula'ir, he says, and to elucidate what I mean. שאין זה עניין שנתחדש על ידי רבינו הזקן. He says, don't think what I'm telling you is just an interesting insight of the Baal HaTanya ושער ייחוד ואמונה. אלא עניין זה נמצא כבר בדברי הרמב"ם. What I've just told you is a Rambam. כפי שמתאים לתורת החסידות של רבינו הזקן, בפרט בתורת החסידות של הצמח צדק, שבכמה עניינים מביאים את דברי הרמב"ם. He says, in fact, Baal HaTanya, the Tzemach Tzedek as well, all quote the Rambam's words here from Hilchot Yesodei. Okay, sorry for that slight technical hitch. So I want to continue as we were learning the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Perush in Torah Menachem, where he makes reference to the Rambam's Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. I think this is where we left it off. He says, "Ba'atchalat Sefer Yad Chazaka b'Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah." The beginning of the Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, as we know, in Perek Aleph Halacha Bet. Kotev HaRambam, the Rambam writes, "Ve'im ya'aleh al hadat shu ein matzui, ein davar acher yachol limatzot." If it would dawn on you that God couldn't exist, then nothing else could exist itself. Abir Advarim, and continues the Rebbe, and he says as follows. And the meaning of this is as such. Rabbeinu HaZaken mevi b'sha'ar yichud hamunah. He now quotes the Baal HaTanya in the Sha'ar Yichud Ve'emunah. Further idea, which in fact I'd like to share with you in English for you to understand fully, and we'll go through the Hebrew again. So let me stop sharing and start sharing again. We're going to look at now the Sefer Tanya, and he says as follows. Here it goes, sharing that. He says, the root of the error is those who deny the individual divine providence and the signs and miracles recorded in the Torah are revealed. They err, making a false analogy and comparing the work of God, creator of heaven and earth, to the work of man and his schemes. When a goldsmith has made a vessel, that vessel is no longer dependent upon the smith. And even when his hands are removed from it and he goes away, the vessel remains in exactly the same image and form as when it left the hands of the smith. In the same way, these fools conceive the creation of heaven and earth, but their eyes are covered and they fail to see the great difference between the work of man and his schemes, which consists of making one thing out of another which already exists, merely changing the form and appearance from an ingot of silver to a vessel, the making of heaven and earth, which is creatio ex nihilo. So what is the Baal HaTanya saying? And let's see it again in the text. He says, Rabbeinu HaZaken mevi b'sha'ar yichud ve'emunah she'yeshnam ele sheto'im b'dimyonam hakozev she'madmin ma'aseh Hashem ba'aseh shemayim ba'atad ma'aseh enosh v'tach v'lo. People confuse the way God created the world with the way human people make certain things. When a person makes something, then once it's made, you don't need the maker anymore. The maker is now redundant. They're part of the history of the item. Even when his hands are no longer on the item itself stands on its own merit, stands on its own existence. If that's the case, a person may erroneously think that this is the same way that God creates heaven. God made the world and now is no longer actively involved. This is what the Rambam fundamentally disagrees with. He's already alluded to the Baal HaTanya's statement of this. If it would dawn on you to think that God isn't existing, then nothing else could exist. When we talk about He, God, we're talking about the power that continues to bring reality into existence. This is why it's such an important idea to interpret, he says, as the Baal HaTanya does, that the word machayeh means ma'aveh, because machayeh seems to suggest that God creates things into existence, and then God is comparable to a person who creates a particular item. That's not the case. Ultimately, God creates the world and continues to do so, and absent of God, the world couldn't and doesn't exist itself. Ad Kan, the Torah Menachem, which I hope makes sense. I hope is clear to you. What I want us to now do is continue on. And in order to continue on, I want us to first look at a different section, not of Balatanya, but instead of the Rambam himself in his Moreh Nevuchim. With 1 second. Let me share my screen. And I want to read a section from the Moreh Nevuchim that we're going to get to, because it's going to help and explain the Rambam in the Yad Chazakah. Remember, we mentioned last time the Rambam wrote the Perush Mishnayos first, then the Yad Chazakah, meaning the Mishnah Torah, and then the Moreh Nevuchim. And at times, the things he writes in Moreh Nevuchim, which is written with more sophisticated language, which sheds light on what he says in the Mishnah Torah. So we're going to see this specifically. So let's look at the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, Part 1, Chapter 69. Everything existing and endowed with a form is whatever it is through its form. And when that form is destroyed, its whole existence terminates and is obliterated. The same is the case as regards the relation between God and all distant causes of existent beings. It is though the existence of God that all things exist, and it is He who maintains their existence by that process which is called emanation, shefa, as will be explained in one of the chapters of the present work. If God did not exist, suppose this were to be possible, the universe would not exist. There would be an end to the existence of the distant causes, the final effects, and the intermediate causes. Consequently, God maintains the same relation to the world as a form has to a thing endowed with a form. Through the form it is what it is, and on it the reality and essence of the thing depends. In this sense, we may say that God is the ultimate form. He is the form of all forms. That is to say, the existence and continuance of all forms in the last instance depend on Him. The forms are maintained by Him, the same way as all things endowed with forms retain their existence through their forms. On that account, God is called in the sacred language Olamim, Chei Olamim, the life of the universe, as will be explained. Let me tell you now why I wanted us to have a look at this piece from the Moreh Nevuchim. We previously learned Halacha Bet, and we've since learned the Torah Menachem, which explains what it means that if one would imagine that God doesn't exist, no other being could possibly exist. Let's now reflect on Halacha Gimel, which talks about the uniqueness of God. If one would imagine that none of the entities aside from God would exist, He alone would continue to exist, and nullification of their existence would not nullify His existence. If you recall, I summarized this Halacha in 3 points. If only gods exist and we wouldn't, our lack of existence wouldn't negate God's existence. We need God, but God doesn't need us, and God's truth is different than us. With this in mind, I'd like to quote from the Yalkut Biurim on the Rambam. Do you remember I showed you this newer edition of the Mishnah Torah? At the back there's a Yalkut Biurim. And amongst the commentaries it brings is itself the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim. Here it says the following: this is on the words. It says that that which is being created are in need of God. We need God, which is a deep philosophical and theological statement. But let's just make sense of what these words mean. The Mefarish, remember the Mefarish we looked at last week as well. It's not just God is a first cause, and then the world continued to be. Instead, God is a cause of the continuing existence of all things. And then it quotes the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, which says, and we just read it, this is why God is referred to as the life of all the worlds, that God gives life to the world. We saw earlier the reference to the word machayeh and mahaveh. Sometimes God's referred to as the form of the world. This is said in a kind of in brevity, in a brief way, in a kind of nickname manner. If you say the word kinoi, you've just been learning Masechet Nedarim, we're learning Daf Yomi. It's a word we're already familiar with. Just as if a form is lost, then an item loses its very essence. So to ken im ya'aleh adat she'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzui titpatel mitzvot b'orei kula. God is the form of the world. Absent of God, there is no world. And this is the piece that we just read before in the Moreh Nevuchim in English, which is quoted here. Aval k'mo she'kol nimtza b'al tzura omnam u'mashu b'tzurato k'sifzat tzurato tifsad evato v'tivatel כמו כן היחס בעצמו יחס הבורא בכל פרטיו הנמצא ברחוקות כי במציאות הבורא הכל נמצא. Ultimately, God is the ultimate form. That's why we refer to God as the Tzurat HaOlam, Chei HaOlamim. God's existence is necessary for the rest of the world's existence. So let's just review the halachot that we've been studying. We learned halacha bet, and we reflected on the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov and the Balatanya. We have since moved on to halacha gimel, that God exists, and if one would imagine that none of the entities aside from his exist, God will continue to exist. And the key point being emphasized by the Rambam is we need God. We need God. We need God because without God, as we said in halacha bet, we couldn't exist. So far, so good. What I want to now dwell on is this idea of emet, truth. Remember, we saw this being discussed at the end of halacha gimel and in halacha dalet. What does it mean that ein amitato k'amitat echad mehem, that God's truth is not like the truth of any other beings? When we say Hashem Elokechem emet, what the Rambam seems to be suggesting is ulvado ha'emet. Only God is truth. What does that mean? That we don't have truth? That we aren't truthful? So I want to quote from Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who wrote a remarkable commentary on the Rambam called Yad Pshuta. Here, in fact, he's not actually saying his own words, he's just quoting from other texts, but he does us a great favor by doing so. He says here, Emet, Usham Barachot, Hashem Elokechem Emet, Ma'u Emet, what is being referred to as the word Emet, Amarav Abin Shuhu Elohim Chayim Umelech Olam. He, God, is life, the king of the world. Beyond this, though, Gam Yerushalmi Sanhedrin Hosifu. The Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin added a further layer of meaning. The word emet is made up of three letters. Aleph, Resh, Aleph, Resha, Alpha, Beta. Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet. Mem is the middle, as we know, and Taf is the end. Why do we therefore refer to God as emet? Ani Hashem Rishon. Emet refers to the letter Aleph, saying God is the first cause. Mem represents the middle, Mi Baladai En Elohim. Without me, there would be no God, because any shutaf, I have no part. Right? I'm right there in the middle. There's no other middleman, basically, in terms of creation. God is the first cause, God is the middleman. And I'm the last set to. I'm not passing on the management of the world, anything else. So what the Yerushalmi basically is telling us is that here in the Rambam, where he refers to Ein Amitato Kamitat Echad Mehem, the word emet, meaning God first cause, God is a middleman, God is going to be right at the end of the party called the creation of the world, that the word emet alludes to this constant presence, which, if you recall, is beautifully described by the Perush, by the Mefarish, as being God isn't just a sibat yitzirat kol haborim, elagam sibat hatmadat kiyuma sheb'chol et. However, I want to give a further explanation of the word emet, because what the Rambam does seem to imply is that there is a limitation of our truth versus the absolute truth of God. And here Moshe Steinbach writes in his commentary on Emunah HaTorah, he says as follows, and this is based primarily on halacha dalet, but obviously, which is itself explaining halacha gimel. Something can have truth but not be entirely true. He says this is basically the rules of what is truth in terms of the natural. Something can have truth but not be entirely true. Things can change. As we saw in Egypt, what do we mean by that? There is a truth, for example, that generally water stays flat, stays, on where it's supposed to be. But then God averted that truth and created Kriyat Yamsuf, and the water then was like Kechomah Miminam Yisvanal. So, what is the truth about water? The truth is that most of the times it's this way, but sometimes it can be that way. The truth is most times things are one way, sometimes could be another way. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu continues on Moshe Shterach about God. Its very essence is truth. Lo shayach bo ela emet. Only truth applies to God. Rambam. He therefore says that's why it's good the way the Rambam explains things. En emet kamot. That there is no truth like God's truth. And then he tells us an interesting halacha in terms of applying this theology in terms of Jewish practice. He now quotes a commentary on the Rambam known as the Yad HaMelech. If I make an oath and I say it's true according to the definition of truth of God, that is a false oath. Because your truth can never be God's truth. Meaning, if I make an oath that I can either achieve clarity of truth the way God has, or that what I'm describing is as true as God's truth, my oath is false because that is an impossible achievement for Basar Vadam, for a human being. Only to God is a word emet truly able to be applied. Yes, we endeavor to speak truth. Nevertheless, there are elements of untruth in the human situation as compared to God. If a person makes an oath in the name of God, that God knows something, that's fine. But if you make an oath that you're saying the truth of God's truth, that is a deceitful oath. Well, it's a shvat check. So let's now summarize. We've had a chance to learn through these three halachot, and I'm sorry for any technical hitches that we may have had in the recording of this video, and of course I'm deeply sorry that I'm not there with you. But we learned from the first halacha that without God there's nothing. This is absolute in terms of Jewish belief. Absolute. And it's expressed in so many deeds that we do, such that we go back to our point from our first session. Without this machshava, this is likely to undermine some of our ma'asim, some of the deeds that we do. And we learned the Torah Menachem explains this idea that God is not like the person who makes something out of gold or silver. But once it's made, it's done. God is a constant creator. Point number 2, we need God. God is the form of the world. Absent of God, there is no world. God doesn't need us. God would continue to exist absent of us. We couldn't exist for a moment absent of God. And we continued and we spoke about truth. What does it mean to be true? Why is the word emet such a central word vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Well, Rav Nachum Rabinovich quoted the Yerushalmi, said emet actually isn't just the notion of saying God is true, or it's true that God exists, but it alludes to the fact that God is a first cause, God is a middleman, God is they're going to be there at the end of the world if there's such a thing. But fundamentally, God is the sole divine presence. But moreover, Moshe Shterach basically says, don't ever be so presumptuous that you can achieve or that you can reach the emet of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The emet of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is unique. And that's why we worship God, because God is unique. God is great. God is a creator. Without God, we couldn't exist. And if we meditate on these ideas, hopefully we enrich our appreciation of why we do what we do. and what it means to be a true Eved Hashem. To be a true Eved Hashem is to recognize that without that Hashem, everything ceased to be. Thank you very much.